Have you ever sat through a meeting or presentation that should have been great, but left you drained or disengaged? Chances are it wasn't the content, it was the facilitation, which I think is probably one of the main causes why so many of us have had Zoom fatigue, has been down to facilitation. In this episode of Present Influence, I'm joined by expert facilitator and author Therese Miclot, someone who believes that facilitation is like the baking soda in a cake. You only notice it when it's missing, but everything falls flat without it. We're going to be diving into things like how to stop meetings from dragging out, what to say when someone hijacks the discussion, the subtle shift that instantly increases psychological safety, and how anyone, not just leaders, can become the person who moves the room forward. As Therese says, facilitation starts inside. The thoughts you bring into the room will shape the room. So stick around because this episode might just change how you show up in every conversation. Welcome to Present Influence, the show for professional communicators who want to impact, influence, and inspire with their talks and presentations. My name is John Ball, keynote and communication coach, and your guide on this journey to mastery level communication skills.
First of all, let me officially welcome to Present Influence, Therese Miclot. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here, John.
I'm delighted that you are here because we're talking today about a topic that I don't think I really have covered. It may have been mentioned on the show before, but we certainly haven't covered it in any depth. We certainly can't think of a time we ever had a whole show about it, which is one about facilitation. And this is your area of expertise, right?
Yes, it is my
Fantastic.
passion.
Great. And so I have my idea in my head about what facilitation is, and I don't necessarily know that it's going to match up 100% with yours. So for our listener and for me, how would you define facilitation in the terms of how you work with it?
Okay. Well, I will introduce it this way. If you are a baker and you want to follow a recipe to bake a cake, and John, do you bake?
I do, actually. I love baking, yeah.
Okay. So we follow a recipe, let's say for a delicious chocolate cake, and one of the ingredients is baking soda. You can make the cake without baking soda. It'll actually come out and it will taste like a chocolate cake, but something will be missing because baking soda is a leavening agent, and it is an important element of the recipe. And I think of facilitation like a leavening agent in that I think most of us experience meetings every day, and some of them are great, where we're energized, where the time flies, where we're getting a lot of things done. And then there's other meetings in our day or presentations or sessions where it's just dragging and it's just, when will this be over? And couldn't this be an email? And sometimes you can't necessarily put your finger on what's missing. Just like in the cake, it's facilitation skills because it's often like goes unnoticed until you really reflect on like, why would I always dread that meeting? Or why do I like always look forward to getting together with this group? So it's a leavening agent in any interaction that you need. And I'm not talking about those for professional facilitators or trainers. I'm talking about all of us that have to get things accomplished and done with others.
I must admit, you are making me think of the first time I tried baking and confused baking powder and baking soda. And that was not good and not a mistake I ever made again.
They don't make it easy. It's almost identical. So it's not you, John.
Well, yeah, I thought they were the same thing and they're not. Which again, maybe may have some ideas about facilitation that are not quite accurate. But we probably all have to do some level of facilitation at some point, right?
Yeah.
What are the areas of facilitation that you most commonly work with people on?
It's wherever they have to show up and influence really effectively. So a lot of times I'm coaching people who are technically brilliant. They know their craft, they know their domain, and now they've been promoted into a role where they're expected to lead the organization or present on the latest feature or functionality of a new product. And they lean very heavily on their subject matter expertise, but they're recognizing that they're losing their audience, that it's hard to get people to talk or engage. or they leave the meeting feeling like that didn't go as well as I hoped. They don't know quite why. So that would be one of the main examples of where I work with people who have to find themselves in a position where they need to get a group of people to work effectively together.
Yeah. And for someone like myself, who's a speaker and a coach and a podcaster, facilitation does still come into play in a number of areas. Like if I'm working with VAs or I have people coming and helping me with various parts of my business or at events, I still have to facilitate meetings. I used to do a lot of sales meetings for personal development companies that I worked for
Yeah.
and would be facilitating there. And I look back and I'm not always sure that I did the very best job of that, but that was probably where I have mostly encountered
Mhm.
facilitation in my
Well,
professional life. But
yes.
I do also see, like, that's for me delivering it, at least. Where I've probably received it more has been when I've worked with other companies and been pulled into meetings there and seeing that doesn't always go well. And often a meeting will get scheduled for an hour or an hour and a half or 2 hours.
Yeah.
And like you say, you sit there thinking, this is a very long meeting, and are
Yeah.
we really achieving anything here? So
Right.
there's some big mistakes that people commonly make with facilitation, right?
There are. And I start with even the example you gave is like sometimes like it's not quite right or you didn't have the impact. And I think that sometimes we think that facilitation means you should be a good presenter. Like you should have good slides and good information. And I'd say that's not the starting point. I think that there's different places to start. For example, part of your preparation should be managing the voice in your head. So how often do we walk into meetings and we're already saying to ourselves, we're not saying it out loud, like, this is going to be rough, or no one's going to buy into this, or don't screw up, or you better make this go well, or your boss is sitting in the room, so don't say anything that's going to upset her or him. And that's often where I begin because facilitation starts inside out. The fact of the matter is, whatever thoughts you have going into your weekly meeting or a sales pitch or a conference where you might be a speaker or you've been asked to present to the more senior level leaders, we often just start with getting the slides right or the message right. And I think you have to get your head right first because
Yeah.
is a billboard on your forehead. So if you go into a meeting and you're thinking to yourself, this is going to go bad, or no one's going to buy this, or I hope they don't ask me any questions, it affects your emotions. So, John, you tell me, what might you be feeling if you're thinking to yourself, don't screw up?
I'm probably more likely to think the thing that my granddad and my dad taught me all through my life of if in doubt, keep your mouth shut. So, probably more likely to do that.
Yeah. Okay. So you're going to have some emotions around, might be anxious or worried or unsure. And the reality is, our thoughts drive our behaviors. So the way it
Yeah.
tends to show up when I'm observing a lot of people to give them feedback, they talk very fast. So when we get nervous, that can be a tendency. So we don't ask any questions because we don't want to risk the meeting going off track when we have our agenda that we have to cover and we have a lot of things to cover. We don't make eye contact. We will lower our own credibility by saying something like, I coached someone with this last week. She would say at the start of the meeting, well, I'm still learning here. I've only been with the company for 6 months, so I might have gotten it wrong. And automatically, as a start to what she was going to say, lowers her credibility
Yeah.
because she's nervous and she was around other people who had more experience than her. So we
Yeah.
we could be our worst enemy when it comes to how we show up when we're trying to influence or work with a group of people. And so that's the answer to the question, where do I start? It's typically inside before we start to work outside.
I could be wrong here, and I want to check in with this with you. But is this kind of relevant to not just the facilitator, but to the people who are in the meeting as well? Like we all have some responsibility to a degree for good facilitation and meetings.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I always say that you can facilitate from any seat at the table because sometimes we think, oh, well, we're going to sit back and someone's going to lead us in this meeting or they own the meeting. And I think that's such a missed opportunity for all of us. So
Yeah.
I'll give you an example. I was in a meeting where a leader was speaking about something, and it was very clear that people were not on board. And so this person just kept talking, asked things like, I think you can all agree we should do this, right? Right? It's very hard sometimes to tell a leader, no. And this wise person, in a very respectful way, caught it and said to the leader, I'm not sure that everyone really is on that same page. Can we talk a bit about that? And it had the effect of slowing down the leader, who was very kind of forceful and wanting to just move very quickly in the meeting, because that person who did not have authority but was in the meeting caught the behavior, caught and read the signals that people were dropping, and had the fortitude to say something that redirected that meeting in a really effective way.
Which is good. And I will say, from some of my past experiences, I haven't always felt the level of psychological safety that I would want
Yeah.
to have to
Yeah.
express myself in those kinds of meetings. And I do think often, if that isn't there, you may not find out what people really think until they're on their way out and they've got
Oh,
nothing left to lose anymore. And even then, they might still want a good reference or whatever, they still might not tell you.
right.
So I wonder what advice you maybe have for people who are facilitating, whether they are the leader of the meeting or whether they're in the meeting,
Yeah.
for helping to develop that level of psychological safety
Yeah.
where people do feel they can speak up.
Oh, it's so wise and it's so true, right? If we really want to get a group of people to engage and interact with you, you have to set the table for those conditions. And one is that they won't be fearful of saying something that might be contradictory to your point of view. So as a facilitator, I think you can do a few things. One is, and what I coached this leader on later, was how you ask a question will inform people of whether or not it's safe to answer. So for instance, he was just saying, I think we can all agree that this is the right decision because we have to make this decision by the end of the meeting, right? 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 That's not a phrase of a question that's going to invite genuine response. What I coached him to do was to add context before the question so people understand why you're asking the question, what you might do with it, and what's the motive behind your question. So for instance, instead of, I think we can all agree, right? What we worked on was to say, all right, we really don't have any more time to debate this conversation or this decision, but I am genuinely interested in hearing everyone's point of view. So I would like to hear, if we go this way, what are some of the implications? So previewing the question. Or another great one, and I worked with someone else the other day, his questions sounded like test questions. And so people, as adults, we don't want to go back to feeling like we're in school and we better answer the question right, or we're going to look bad in front of our peers and in front of our teacher, so to speak. Because his questions had this frame of right or wrong. So what we work to create some psychological safety is to give context to the question. And it was simple. It was, there's no right or wrong to this question. I'm just looking for everyone's opinion on how they're thinking about this.
Right.
And then he asked the question. So now people aren't wondering, where are you trying to go with that question? Why are you asking me that? And by the way, I think we do it all the time, every day, without bad intention. How many times, John, do you get a text that says, do you have a second? Do you have a second? What do you think when you get those few words in a text? Do you have a second?
I generally think you could have just told me what you want and saved us both some time, but yeah.
Right? And I would think if it's a client of yours or someone that view as having high status, you might start to, okay, I wonder what that was. Did I send something by mistake? Did
Right.
I,
Oh, I've had that
there's
experience.
something I
Yeah.
missed? We do that to each other all the time. And again, it's not
Yeah.
bad intention. And a simple way to make it safe or easier for people is to add context to the question. So it might be, yeah, I want to introduce you to my leader. Do you have a second? I bet your
Yeah.
answer would be one thing. Or maybe it's something hilarious just happened. Do you have a second? Well, you might answer that differently because I don't have a second, maybe later.
Right.
So that's one very quick tip I would offer to your listeners. If you want to create more likelihood for people to genuinely answer your question, just give context, preview the question with why are you asking it?
Right. Because the natural human response is to catastrophize an unknown, right?
Oh,
To think, what could this be about?
all
And
the
I
time.
do feel into what you say there are people who must on some, they say, no, often a different version of that I've seen that I really hate is we need to talk. And in fact, that's one that definitely triggers people into thinking, I must have done something. I must have messed up and starting to think the worst. And then sometimes you get onto speaking to them and it's nothing major at all. And like, well,
Yeah.
those words definitely do indicate there
Oh,
might be something wrong, right?
I'll tell you where I still feel guilty, and this happened many years ago. I was working in a HR function and I was busy. I was busy running from meeting to meeting, and I was walking by the desk of one of my direct reports. And on my way back to my office, I said, "Can you see me in my office?" So she comes, remember, I'm in HR. She comes into my office, blood drained from her face, and she says, "Are you going to fire me?" I said, "What? How would you think that?" She's like, "Well, when you said, 'Can you come to my office?' I thought it must be Dad." I said, "Oh, no, I wanted to show you, I don't know, something that I didn't have on my computer at the time." So I think it's a symptom of how fast we're moving these days.
Right.
And especially the more you work with your colleagues, the more it's easy for you to jump to the conclusion that they know where I'm coming from, that they know what I mean by this. And the reality is that's not the case because everybody has that self-talk. Everybody's filling in the blank if you
Yeah.
don't give them context.
100%. I love that. I love that you brought that up because I think that's something that most people are going to be able to relate to, either having done it or being on the receiving end or both.
It's easy, John, to fix.
That's for pretty much everyone, right? I know my first thought this morning was like, after having a whole day without power yesterday, I'm now a day behind on an already busy week. And like,
Yeah.
yeah, it doesn't help anything. So mindset is the first element that we need to wrap our heads around and work on improving for ourselves for
Yes.
good facilitation. What else is going to be important to think about or focus on?
Sure. In the book that I co-wrote, The Facilitation Advantage, we talk about it in three main areas. So mindset is one we just talked about. Content is another area, and that's about not just having subject matter expertise, but how you convey it to different audiences so that it's well received and understood. And then the third component is process. How do you help groups move from point A to point B? Or if you're in a selling situation, how do I get someone to understand and connect their problem to my solution? And so I'll give you a few and then we can play around with whatever
Yeah,
sounds
love that.
most intriguing at the moment. So there's things like one underused skill that is so paramount in facilitation is listening. Listening. And I think oftentimes we think, oh, well, again, we better have our script, we better have our notes, we better know what to say. And we lean very heavily on talking when listening is as essential, maybe sometimes more essential than having the perfectly scripted response. So there's listening, there's storytelling. So I don't know about you, John, but some days it feels like endless meetings. And sometimes I have the misfortune of needing to have a meeting with someone. It's 3 p.m. They're exhausted, right? We all are after endless day of meetings. And I need to influence their thinking on something. Well, I have a choice. I could just give facts. I could give details. I could offer research. Or I have another choice. I could tell a story. And storytelling is another really useful tool and skill for all of us when we want to stand out, because the reality is story is meaning. It's how, as humans, we make meaning, and it's sticky. So if you want to be memorable at that 3 o'clock meeting and not just blend in with all the other meetings that you had, then it's worth getting better at how you craft a story that will be meaningful to your audience. So storytelling,
Okay.
adapting for impact. Yes.
Sorry, are there particular kinds of stories that you're talking about here, or kind of any kind of storytelling?
Yeah, and actually, there's a lot of variety of the story you can tell. You can tell stories that are examples of mistakes to avoid. You can tell your story, your personal story. You can tell the story of another person and so repeat their story. You can use metaphor or analogy, which I work with a lot of, again, very technical people who have to translate very complex things into easily understood concepts, especially when they're presenting to senior leaders who don't have an engineering degree or don't have the same right level of sophistication with whatever technology. And we work a lot on try to frame it as a metaphor because that becomes much more instantly understood because we can relate to it.
Right.
So,
I saw a really good example of that today.
oh,
And I was watching a clip from Jon Stewart's Daily Show,
mhm.
and he was using the metaphor analogy of WWE wrestling to
Yeah,
explain things that were going on with the government, and it was very clever. It really worked. And I think so. It does sometimes does just help people to stuff that sounds complicated or boring to be able to make those connections and see things that, all right, yeah, it's a bit maybe not exactly like that, but it's a bit like that. So that helps me to
exactly.
comprehend it. I love that.
Well, and the fact that you remembered it
Yes.
and telling me this now is to the point of it's sticky. It helps us make meaning of complex things. Yeah.
Absolutely. So we can all be a bit better at storytelling.
Mhm.
And I know that sometimes there are stories that perhaps get a bit trite and overused. So I think
Sure.
we generally should probably try and
Yeah.
avoid those. But yeah, I do think personal stories or there should be pertinent at the very least to make sure you have the right stories. Yeah.
Yeah. Stories where you want your listener to imagine themselves in the story, this as the main character. And so in some of the workshops we do when we're working on helping people become better storytellers, we use a tool called Advance and Color. Sometimes, and I'll offer my husband as an example, just yesterday, I was asking him, we needed to change something with our utilities in our town. And I simply just wanted, did it happen? Were you able to talk to the right person to change the utilities? And he starts with, well, the first thing I did was I went on the website to try to find the link. And I'm like, advance, go. Did you do it? Did you do it? So sometimes there's some people that need to really work on becoming more advanced with moving more quickly through the story, right? That will lose interest if it's too detailed. So for
Yes.
some people, that's the thing. For
Yeah.
other people, it's color, meaning they need
Okay.
to know more of the texture of the story to imagine themselves in it. Because the opposite was if my husband said, yeah, I did it, was done. But there was an interesting element to it, and that was that the woman that he talked with was someone that he knew, and it was like a mini reunion that happened on this call. That's color. So it was like telling
Right.
so I hadn't seen Pam in 25 years. We're talking on the phone, and she recognized my tone and my name and added color to it. So there's ways in the book that we offer, where is your edge for learning how to tell a story?
Yeah. In my own storytelling experience, I'm one of those people who has a tendency to add too much information or detail into stories and nearly always end up having to think, okay, does this need to be there? Does that need to be there? And try and condense the
Exactly.
story down to these parts that are most effective and relevant, because nobody wants to
Mhm.
hear really those sort of long winding road stories that don't get or take forever to get to the point of what you're actually
Right.
talking about. So I think that's great advice,
Yeah.
something we could
Yeah.
probably all be better at, but something that does take a bit of preparation, I think. It's not just something probably most people are
I'm
going to be able to do on the spot, right?
I'm so glad you said that, John, because that is so true. I think that good storytelling needs a little preparation. And that it's almost like that you over time, you really refine the story. So where do people light up or you draw them in when you're telling the story? And what are parts of the story that, to your point, you can cut out? They're not that essential. They break the rhythm of the story. And I have probably 5 or 6 stories that I have told, I'm not exaggerating, hundreds of times over the course of my career. And I have refined those stories so that they land as intended. And
Yeah,
so I couldn't agree more. I think if you want to be good at storytelling, it requires a little bit of preparation. And I
I
think
agree.
also part of that preparation is to tell it many times to someone that you trust. And you can ask them, where should I move faster through the story? Where should I add more detail? Because we all are storytellers at heart, and we all have heard many stories. So you'll probably be advised well, even by a friend, if they will be honest with you.
Yeah, yeah. Give them permission to give you some honest feedback, even if it's not, no, it doesn't need to, the feedback doesn't need to be, this is fantastic, this is great, I love you, I'm a friend. It needs to be
Exactly.
helpful. What's going to help this story be well received by people? I do a bit of stand-up comedy these days, and I like to get a bit of feedback before I take stuff onto stage.
Yeah.
And it's very helpful, but I need to have honest feedback, and
Yeah.
I can't just have, oh yeah, that's good, that'll work. It's like, well, it might not. So we'll
Right.
find out, but I'd rather know before, at least
Yeah.
somewhat. You never really know how stuff is going to be received till you deliver it.
It's true.
I don't know if this is the right point in the conversation to ask this, but hopefully. But how do you, when you advise people to handle disruptors in the facilitation arrangements?
Well, tell me more. What would be something that you would find disruptive? And then we can play around with what I might do.
So a few different ones spring to mind. I maybe had this more in times where I have facilitated workshops and group coaching events, that someone wants to dominate the conversation. They want to
Mhm.
ask all the questions and they want all the attention.
Uh,
Maybe that's a conscious thing for them, maybe it's not, but that's
Yeah.
what they end up doing. Or someone who is kind of contrarian, perhaps on some level doesn't really want to be there or thinks they know better and isn't being
Mhm.
quiet about that. So those
Mhm.
are a few that spring to mind.
Yeah. Okay. So a couple. I think let's talk first about the person that might be disruptive in that they're speaking too much and not leaving space for other people to speak. I think there's a couple things. One is that when you start to see that, when you start to notice someone speaking over others or more frequently, I will, back to context to a question, here's what I will say. Before I ask the next question, I'm noticing. I'm only hearing from a couple voices, not others. So I'll say, for this next question, I would really like to hear from someone who hasn't spoken up yet. And someone just gave me this feedback in a meeting a couple weeks ago. It happened to be the person who usually over talks. And she comes up to me and she goes, I saw what you did there. And you know what? I got the message. I got the message in the most like kind of supportive way. She's like, I know I can tend to overtalk. And when you said, let's hear from someone who hasn't spoken, that was a helpful signal to me to stay baby out of this one. So that's one way you can proactively, the minute you start to sense that that's becoming an issue, start by inviting other people through the question. Let's hear from someone who hasn't spoken up yet. I'd say that does the trick 50% of the time. Here's another one.
Right.
Sometimes a person needs to be acknowledged. They keep talking when they don't feel like anyone understands them. So this is back to mindset. Instead of looking at them as like, oh, here comes John again. He's going to have something to say. You might think, okay, so what is John not feeling we understand that he needs to know we understand? Because sometimes people will keep talking until they get a sense that you get it. So one way that I often do that is by restating. And restating is just verbalizing your understanding of their point of view. Because when people feel heard and understood, they tend to not feel the need to keep talking. So you can say, yeah, John, I can see your excitement. So you're saying 1, 2, and 3. And then you might say, yeah, and 4, 5, and 6. Okay. So and I'll restate. So the issue is that without power in Portugal, it's hard to do your job. Like, yes, that's it.
Indeed.
Then I would turn to others and say, what do others think? So I'm respecting you, but I'm equally respecting the rest of the group. So that's the second one. The third one that might take a little bit more courage is to talk to that person at a break. And not in a accusatory or stop talking manner, but just say what you notice. I noticed that when we have dialogue, you're the first to speak up and you're frequently speaking up. And when I have done, this is what I found that I don't think I would have known otherwise. And it's happened multiple times. The person will say, well, I've been in enough meetings where no one will talk, and I don't want you to have that experience. And in essence, they're saying they're trying to help me as the facilitator. And I say, oh, do not worry. I'm okay with silence. And in fact, there are people in this room that need a beat. They need a moment to think before they can respond. And when you start speaking, it interrupts their ability to do that. And it's like new awareness. Because I myself going in and talking to those people, they may not know. They may not be aware of what they're doing. And it usually has been because of good intention. It's just misapplied.
Yeah.
The last, one more. And this is for when we're all like physically together, is you need to break eye contact with them. Because when you give eye contact to people, it invites them to keep talking. And so a very simple thing is I would break eye contact with you. I would maybe return to you, but I'm going to break it because that also is a subtle signal. I'm interested in what everybody else has to say.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And of course, for in-person meetings, that's a lot more valuable. Do you think it's something you can also help to pre-frame before you even get started, really, to say, no, this is my expectation of how things, or this is the intention for how I want things to go?
I do. In fact, I think that most of us underuse ground rules or group agreements. And I have found that most group agreements are very basic and not very helpful. They'll be like, we're going to start on time, end on time. Put your devices away. And that's housekeeping, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I use a different set of, and I call them group agreements because that is what they are. I'm trying to get an agreement with the group because when I do, that gives me the ability to course correct the group when things are not being kept, the agreement's not being kept. So for instance, one of my group agreements is usually contribute as much as you consume. So I'm doing a lot of leadership development, and I really truly believe that the wisdom usually is already in the room, even if people are new to leadership or things like that. And so that means that I'm expecting people to contribute. So that's also a message to the people who tend to not speak up enough. Also, consideration is a ground rule. Consideration being we're going to create space for every voice to be heard here and not one to overpower another. And when you treat those as an agreement, because I'm genuinely looking for, can you all agree to that? And will you give me the power to keep us on track when we're off of these agreements? And no one ever says no. And I use them. So if I'm noticing we're only hearing from a few people, not everyone, maybe after a break, I'll come back and I'll say, hey, I want to tell you what I'm noticing. And that is that there's a few people offering their opinion, but not everyone. And I know we agreed that everyone would contribute. So and I'll leave it to the group, what else can we do to make sure that everyone feels as though they have the space to speak up here?
Yeah.
And so
Very important. Have you ever been in a situation where you've been facilitating to a largely resistant room? Like they don't, like a bunch of people who may be here because I have to be here and don't really want to be.
Yeah. What have you, I'll tell you, you do this as well. What do you tend to do?
I tend to sort of I tend to frame things up for them as well. It's like, I want to make this as painless and fun for you as possible and as brief as possible as well. We're not going to have fluff. We're not going to do anything empty. When we're finished, we'll be finished. If that means going early, that will be that. But your participation is going to make this go quicker, because if I have to wait for people to contribute or answer is going to extend our time together. So usually you can get agreement on that they don't want to extend our time together. And we've already started to break down a bit of resistance there as well, I find, because once they're making agreements with you, they're a bit more on your side.
Yeah, I think, again, what I love about facilitation is it's a series of choices, that there's not one right choice. It's a matter of having more options when you encounter whatever you encounter with the group. So I think those choices absolutely make sense. I'll add a few more. I think that people, especially when they're resistant, they're going to test whether or not it's safe to really offer their point of view. And I tend to not want that to be buried under silence. So I will tend to lean into or address what I know to be true, especially around change. Let's say there's going to be an organizational change. I'm working with a group, and I know that there's a lot of concern. There's a lot of resistance to this change. One, I'll acknowledge it, that not everybody is. I'll say what is not being said as a way to create psychological safety, to not become a session where we're just going to complain. But I will acknowledge that everybody's at a different place and opinion of what's going to happen here with this change. So one is, I think, acknowledging where people are at is a powerful thing. The other thing that I will use, my choice, is back to listening, and that is restating. Restating, again, is verbalizing your point of view or another person's point of view. But here's the interesting thing. It's not agreement. It's just that I will be willing to verbalize your understanding. So it might sound like this in this meeting, and we're talking about a change, and I'm talking a bit about the positives that are going to happen with this org change. And you say, I don't know, Therese, we've done this so many times. We've had so many changes over the last couple years. How do we all know we're not going to lose our jobs? So that's what you're going to say. Now, me, I don't know. I have a crystal ball. So I have a choice. I could just say, well, let's table that. I don't know. But I would tend to restate. And I would say, so the way you see it, John, is we haven't figured out how to do this well in the past. And so you're not confident we're going to do this well now. And you're already nodding your head. And you're going to say, right. Because we've had 3 leaders, we've had reduction in force, we've had change in direction 5 times. And so I'll just keep restating. So until you get a sense that we know how to right this ship, it's hard to be on board with this. And then, again, it's not my agreement. It's just that I want you to know I don't necessarily agree. I understand your point of view.
Right.
John, it is the most magical skill, because when people genuinely feel heard and understood, they're going to be more likely to listen to you.
Yeah.
I'm probably not going to keep getting the same amount of resistance from you because I acknowledged it.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And I might even say, how do other people feel? Here's my last trick. When you throw it to the rest of the group, how do other people view it? How do other people see it? It can feel risky to you as a facilitator, because what if it's a pile on? Now they're like, yeah, and blah, 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 blah. But also sometimes what I get is another person saying, well, wait, it's not all bad. The change in leadership has been really positive. We have more investment and more funding than we've ever had. And so sometimes what happens more often than not is I'm not going to debate that person. But their peer will often offer a different point of view. And that changes the dynamic, where you might now be more inclined to listen to that peer who says, well, wait a second, there's been a lot of positive things that happened. Because what you don't want to do, I think, is get into a situation where it's now you and that person back and forth with the resistance. Sure. And everybody has a front row seat to watch this.
Head to head.
Awkward dynamic.
Yeah, probably not what anyone wants, but it's a great tip. I wonder for you, have there been any experiences of facilitation that have stood out to you, like, oh, yeah, this is what it's all about, this is why I do it, where it's just gone so well, or has it just been very memorable for you?
Yeah, I think that What I really love to see is when people feel like the experience is different than anything else. I think most people walk into meetings, trainings, presentations already with this mindset because we've been through so many that are just horrible. Like, oh, here we go again. And when I think that I can bring the baking soda, when I can bring, every meeting doesn't have to be bad. Every training doesn't have to be just drudgery and boring. And this happened recently where someone came up to me and said, I came into today thinking like, I don't even want to be here. I have 1,000 other things I need to do, but I am so glad I was here. This was the best day I've had all month. And I really believe that it comes down to facilitation skills because most people want to just feel seen and respected and heard in meetings. And there's just a huge deficiency in it.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly, I think you've given us some very good insights into facilitation today and some things that I'm going to be trying out. And so I will be going back through my notes from replaying this episode to get those points myself. But there's more for us to get from you as well. You have written a book, The Facilitation Advantage. Can you tell us a little about that?
Sure. So that book is written for really all your listeners. And by that, I'm not assuming everyone's a professional facilitator or wants to be one. I'm talking about all of us every day where we have to facilitate. So it's written for all of you. It's meant to be very practical. It starts with the self-assessment, and then you can just go to the sections of the book. So if the storytelling, go to that section. If it's listening, go to that section. And to make it easy for your listeners, we have a free self-assessment so that you can really just distill. If I'm going to focus on one or two things and I feel like I could be better at how I manage meetings or how I present information, we'll make it so simple. Go to that self-assessment, and then you can just really hone in on the one or two things that will improve your impact. So that's
Great.
free to everybody.
How can our listener access the free assessment?
So it's at the book website. So it's all one word, thefacilitationadvantage.com.
Perfect.
And you'll find it there.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I'll put a clickable link in the show notes for anyone who wants to access it that way. But great. So I hope you go and do that. I certainly want to check out that free assessment for myself. I think it's very helpful. Therese, you've shared some wonderful things with us today. I don't think anyone's going to be able to come away from this episode not having learned something valuable to help them improve their facilitation. Such a powerful leadership skill for all of us to improve upon. And I'm so glad that you agreed to come and be a guest on the show today. And Therese Miclot, thank you so much for being my guest on Present Influence.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
I personally really enjoyed this chat with Therese and learned a lot about facilitation. Something that I'm so glad we chose a whole episode to focus on because there was a lot there. I wonder what your biggest takeaway has been from this episode, and I would love to hear it as well. So if you're on YouTube, please leave a comment and let me know what you have taken away or any questions that you have having listened to the episode. And if you are a Spotify listener, you can actually post questions and comments in Spotify now. And if you're not already subscribed to the show, now is a great opportunity to do that. I'm assuming if you've listened this long, you probably got some value out of what you heard today. If you haven't already been checking out my new mini series on Cialdini's influence skills for professional speakers and communicators, please do make sure you subscribe to the show so you can check that out. The first episode is already available. The next one is coming on Friday. I hope you'll join me for that. Next Wednesday, my guest will be Esther Avant, and we're going to be talking about another topic that we haven't covered on the show before, which is about stage fitness for speakers and being in good shape, how much of a difference it can really make to how you show up as a speaker and presenter and to how you feel as you present as well. Often many of us, myself included, very self-conscious about our appearance, especially if we have a few extra pounds. So it's talking about how we can get ourselves looking and feeling healthier as speakers and how much of an impact that can make. Super excited to bring that episode to you. I promise you, it's not going to be one of those conversations where you're going to feel bad about yourself if you haven't been exercising or eating well enough, but hopefully one of those ones that will actually give you some great resources and a nice gentle nudge and a bit of inspiration to make some positive changes if you are in the right place to do that right now. Also, next Friday, I'll be continuing a short series on Robert Cialdini's Weapons of Influence for Speakers, and we'll be talking about authority, how to use it correctly, what it really means for speakers, how it's often abused, and some of the reasons why we should perhaps be a little more skeptical of authority in our lives, and a bit more besides. So I hope you'll join me for that. It's a really fun series, and that's only going to be part 2 of the 7 weapons of influence. We'll be continuing into other influence skills and areas that I'm sure you will want to join me for as well. If you have also been following the Coaching Clinic podcast that I do with my good friend Angie, we have now set up its own YouTube channel. So you should be able to see up on the screen a link to that channel. You can go and find us there, subscribe. We need a bit of love there. We're just getting that channel started. We have 1 subscriber right now. So hopefully by the time you're watching this, there might even be a few more people there. But it has its own channel. You'll be able to get all the unique clips and full episodes of the Coaching Clinic podcast with myself and Angie. Hope to see you there too. For now, wherever you're going, whatever you're doing, have an amazing rest of your week. See you next time.